Hi, class. I'm here today to talk to you about Louise Glück, one of the greatest American poets ever, and to read a few of her poems and to just give a sense of why we're looking at her this week. Um, First off, the most important thing to say is that she is the author of many books of poems. The Wild Iris, which is the one that we are reading from, Triumph of Achilles, which is one of my favorite books of poems ever, and tons of others. Ararat, House at Marshland, Seven Ages. I mean, Louise Glück has written many fantastic books, Meadowlands. And why she is so important to me in some ways is that she incorporates a Greek mythology, or she interfaces Greek mythology with contemporary American life in a really interesting way. And so Meadowlands, for instance, is about a woman who is divorcing or having problems with her husband and headed towards divorce, and interwoven with personal poems about that are poems about Penelope and waiting for Odysseus to return after the Greek War and the Trojan War, and they're seamlessly brought together. Village life, descending figure. She also has two books of prose, which you might be interested in, Proofs and Theories, and then I forget the title of the other one. I think it's called American Poetry even. But I want to just give a sense of who she is by saying that I had one encounter with her once, and it goes as follows. I'm sitting on a hillside in Napa, California with Louise Glück, who's the person that I'm most excited to see and meet at this writers' conference, the Napa Valley Writers' Conference. And you get paired with one of the teachers there. So the person I worked with was Frank Bedart, who's a really, really good poet too. But Louise Glück and I were talking on the hillside, and I said, I have this poem, would you mind reading it? And she did, and she said the following: I think the first lines are arresting, and the rest of the poem should be cut, and and that you should start over with those first two lines. I was heartbroken, but she was right. And I ended up tossing the poem at some point. But I kept that in mind. Sometimes the only things of worth in my poem that I'm just writing, that I'm working on, the thing that's the most exhilarating, the thing that's of value, are the first lines. And then I have to cut. Annie Dillard, prose writer mostly, but she wrote poetry too. She said about cutting, what are you, a mouse or a woman? Cut. Take away the thing that's hurting the work. So there's that anecdote about Louise Glück. She's done a great deal for American poetry, and she's been the judge of numerous first book competitions. One of my best friends won a competition that was judged by Louise Glück, and Louise Glück and my friend became tight friends, and they read each other's books when they're newly written. So Glück is a very interesting and supportive figure in American poetry. By way of biography, I don't know that much about her, to be honest. I don't even know if I know where she was. Oh yeah, she was born in New York City, and in 1943. Her grandfather created the X-Acto knife, and so she grew up in wealth and privilege and lived on Long Island. She also became anorexic at an early age and wanted to perish. Came close and pulled back from the brink and ended up starting to write poems. She also wrote poems while she was pregnant, and that is something that I have often thought about in terms of how people work. The idea of writing when you have a child to take care of is something that I think about in relation to my female friends who are writers. So she's written many books. She won everything: the National Book Award, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and recently the National Book Award she won for The Wild Iris. And recently she won the Nobel Prize, the biggest award for literature in the world. So let's cut to the chase and look at her work. So I asked you to read The Wild Iris, or I posted it for you. So I'm going to read that first. At the end of my suffering, there was a door. Hear me out. That which you call death, I remember. Overhead, noises, branches of the pine shifting. Then nothing. The weak sun flickered over the dry surface. It is terrible to survive as consciousness buried in the dark earth. Then it was over. That which you fear, being a soul and unable to speak, ending abruptly, the stiff earth bending a little, and what I took to be birds darting in low shrubs. You who do not remember passage from the other world, I tell you, I could speak again. Whatever returns from oblivion returns to find a voice. From the center of my life came a great fountain, deep blue shadows on azure seawater. There's a lot to be said about this poem. I'd like to direct our attention first to the subject that I'm asking you to focus on in relation to this poem, voice. So, whatever returns from oblivion returns to find a voice. How many ways could I interpret that? Whatever returns from the brink of death, of doom, from anorexia, from drug addiction, from terrible teenage years, from bullying, from being ridiculed, from misogyny in our culture. Whatever returns from oblivion returns to find a voice, and that voice should be strong and powerful. If you look at Louise Glück's work, there is never an excessive word. There's never excess, which means there's never sentimentality either. And I know we've been talking back and forth about this subject of sentimentality, of excess language, of adverbs and adjectives throughout the course. So here's a writer that almost every word is spot on, if not every word. So whatever returns from oblivion returns to find a voice. That voice is comprised of language. The language must be taught, must be only that which is the absolute necessity to say. Her poems are thin, and they seem to squeeze themselves into a single space. The voice in this poem is well aware of suffering. At the end of my suffering, there was a door. But she's also, or it, since it's the wild iris that's speaking, it's aware of having worked through and endured suffering and come out the opposite side of the door and remembering the other world, the passage from the other world. So this voice is something that all of us could learn from, it seems to me. So there's nothing excessive. It's a voice of wisdom, and it's a voice of a flower. So this book, The Wild Iris, was written from Glück's experience, or how it began at least, is from Glück's experience of gardening and looking at gardening catalogs. And suddenly, she says, she started hearing poems in the voices of flowers. And then the voice of a woman came, the poet as a woman came. And then the voice of God, an Old Testament God, or a Torah God, came. And all three of those voices are interwoven in this fascinating book. I'd like to look closely at one stanza. Then it was over, colon, that which you fear, being a soul and unable to speak, ending abruptly, the stiff earth bending a little, and what I took to be birds darting in low shrubs. This to me seems to be a quintessentially Glickian stanza. The way she uses the colon, then it was over, that which, and then the insertion of you the reader, right? She's engaging with us as readers, as a you. Then, I didn't realize I didn't turn my lights on, sorry. Then she is breaking the line at really interesting points. Then it was over, that which you fear, comma, being, and the being is enjammed, and so the logic of the line doesn't make sense until the next line, being a soul and unable. So being a soul, but the way she's cut this line, that which you fear, comma, being, is its own logic. I fear being in a body on the earth, alive, and I fear being a soul also. Being a soul and unable, a soul that's unable to do what? To speak. So the enjambments are working really hard in this poem. Fascinating to me. Ending abruptly, the stiff earth, bending. So bending and ending are in direct rhyme with each other. And Glück is not a huge proponent of rhyme, sing-songy to her, but she uses it judiciously in the midst of lines. And then the colon at the end of the penultimate stanza, whatever returns from oblivion returns to find a voice. Suffering, right? Suffering leads to, from the center of my life came a great fountain. Deep blue shadows on azure seawater. The suffering seems to have led to possibility. Here's another one of the poems from this book. Matins, which is spoken from the voice of the human. Unreachable Father, when we were first exiled from heaven, you made a replica, a place in one sense different from heaven, being designed to teach a lesson, otherwise the same. Beauty on either side, beauty without alternative. Except we didn't know what was the lesson. Left alone, we exhausted each other. Years of darkness followed. We took turns working the garden, the first tears filling our eyes as earth misted with petals, some dark red, some flesh-colored. We never thought of you, whom we were learning to worship. We merely knew it wasn't human nature to love only what returns love. Trillium. When I woke up, I was in a forest. The dark seemed natural. The sky through the pine trees thick with many lights. I knew nothing. I could do nothing but see. As I watched, all the lights of heaven faded to make a single thing, a fire burning through the cool firs. Then it wasn't possible any longer to stare at heaven and not be destroyed. Are there souls that need death's presence as I require protection? I think if I speak long enough, I will answer that question. I will see whatever they see, a ladder reaching through the firs, whatever calls them to exchange their lives. Think what I understand already. I woke up ignorant in a forest. Only a moment ago, I didn't know my voice if one were given me. I didn't know my voice, if one were given me, would be so full of grief, my sentences like cries strung together. I didn't even know I felt grief until the word came, until I felt rain streaming from me. And here's one of the poems from the voice of God. End of summer. After all, things occurred to me. The void occurred to me. There is a limit to the pleasure I had in form. I am not like you in this. I have no release in another body. I have no need of shelter outside myself. My poor, inspired creation, you are distractions, finally mere curtailment. You are too little like me in the end to please me. And so adamant, you want to be paid off for your disappearance, all paid in some part of the earth, some souvenir, as you were once rewarded for labor, the scribe being paid in silver, the shepherd in barley, although it is not earth that is lasting, not these small chips of matter. If you would open your eyes, you would see me. You would see the emptiness of heaven mirrored on earth, the fields vacant again, lifeless, covered with snow. Then white light, no longer disguised as matter. Let me read one other poem, which is from The Triumph of Achilles, which is from the 80s. I think it's 86, 85. The first poem, Mock Orange. So another flower poem, really. Mock Orange is associated with romantic love, with marriage. So it's a plant with white flowers that smell of orange, strongly symbolizing romantic love. Mock orange, it is not the moon, I tell you, it is these flowers lighting the yard. I hate them. I hate them as I hate sex, the man's mouth sealing my mouth, the man's paralyzing body, and the cry that always escapes, the low, humiliating premise of union. In my mind tonight, I hear the question and pursuing answer fused in one sound that mounts and then is split into the old selves, the tired antagonisms. Do you see? We were made fools of. And the scent of mock orange drifts through the window. How can I rest? How can I be content when there is still that odor in the world? Amazing voice. I look forward to hearing what you all have to say about voice in a poem, right? In her poem, The Wild Iris. Voice is absolutely critical, absolutely crucial. And my question really is, how much softness can we bear in a voice in a poem? How much sentimentality can we bear? How much of poetry is soft, is not sturdy? This woman's voice is the sturdiest voice in American poetry today. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'll talk to you in the discussion forums.